Hello and welcome to week 3 of our Parish Lenten series. Uh, the first reading at Mass this past weekend outlined for us the Ten Commandments, and for many that has been kind of the guiding force for living the Christian moral life. And in thinking about remaining faithful in times of struggle, I thought about the many challenges that we've all faced in this past year since the pandemic started. The temptation to not wear a mask and to meet with people that we love, the temptation to work the system to get our vaccine early. Some have applied for government loans or unemployment that they did not deserve. Others have spent a lot of time with inappropriate viewing on the internet. Many websites are filled with hate language due to the past election, and many family relationships and old friendships have been broken over arguments, again, of a political nature. It's been hard to remain faithful in times of struggle and live the moral life. As we looked around for a video that would talk about Christian morality, it was difficult to find one that captured what the staff was looking for. And so they invited me to share some reflections with you about how I review all of this. I don't have a slick video producer, and I couldn't find an astronaut for the opening segment. So you just have me, a fellow sinner, doing my best to help you to understand a different way of approaching Christian morality. And so, what I'd like to do with you in this session 3 is share with you kind of my experiences and my education on approaching the moral life. And hopefully, you'll find some insights in that for your own life of faith. I hope to do this in 3 parts. First, by kind of examining our understanding of sin, then maybe exploring a new way of approaching all of this, and then finally a practical guide to moral decision making. And so I would like to just start with our own understanding of sin. And so maybe looking back at the past and what many Catholics have grown up with, it feels like if something felt good, it must be a sin. Too much sex, too much overspending, too much overeating. A kind of scrupulosity invaded the church in the Middle Ages and never really left. And it seemed like over time the church became almost obsessed with sin and guilt, most often sexual, with little talk about sins against the poor or racial inequity or matters of war and politics. And some say we're still in that point today, though. It seemed that sinning became about going to confession and then with very little talk about changing your life. Sin was neatly divided into categories: venial sin, mortal sin, and everybody was pretty comfortable with that. A line that was often quoted about a good part of American Catholicism, as well as the entire world, has been Catholics were called to pray, to pay, and to obey. It was a very black and white system. It kept the masses of people in line, yet very little attention was paid to individual situations and people's daily lives and experiences. And so, in many ways, I think it was a deficient system. So, where are we at today in the moral life? I think that many people are hung up on American individualism. No one can tell me what to do. It's no one's business. I can believe and act in any way I please. Many people are been accused of being cafeteria Catholics, picking and choosing things they could believe in church. I think church leaders lost much of their credibility with the sexual abuse scandal, and so people don't really look to official teachings for guidance. And yet, as bad as it is, or as bad as some people think it might be, I think that many are searching for moral guidance. So, where do I think we're heading into the future in our understanding of sin? I think we, as a believing community of Catholics, have been always committed to the moral life. I believe that the church can offer a rich tradition to help with conscience formation and moral decision making. There may be things you disagree with in the church and you choose to dissent from. And I think that the church is okay with that, or at least the church's tradition is okay with that. But there are other things other moral dilemmas that, after reading about the long history of church teachings and guidance, I think you might change your mind. Everybody makes moral choices every day. I think the church has an important voice here. And I think we have a long tradition, a helpful tradition, that many have dismissed in favor of moral systems that maybe they've created in their minds or created by looking at the internet. So let's look at how all of this unfolded in the church. I think in the past, the church kind of held on to a juridical model of understanding sin, meaning our approach to the Christian life was a series of do's and don'ts. The church taught you what was right and what was wrong. It was very black and white, and you don't really have to think about it. You just have to know the rules. Uh, there seemed to be little consideration for life situations or the age of the sinner or the relationships of the sinner or the way they were raised. The primary motivation for the juridical model was fear. I mean, if you sin, well, you'll go to hell. If you displease God, you'll go to hell. It was a system that really served an uneducated church for centuries, but in so many ways it was really juvenile and didn't really help an adult Catholic. I don't think that fear can ever be a basis for a relationship, and fear can really be no basis of a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I think that that's why Vatican II came to us with a different model, which makes a lot more sense, at least for me. And that model, moving away from a juridical model of understanding sin, is what they call a relational model. I think that this model of approaching the moral life is based on a whole different set of motivations, meaning we don't live a moral life out of fear of God, but rather out of love for God. And everything we do is motivated by that love and our love manifested in our relationship with God, our relationship with our family, our neighbors, strangers on the street. This model kind of points to the idea that you are not content to just follow rules. You would like to grow in your relationship with God. This model requires that you know yourself, that you're self-reflective, but also that you know your responsibilities. It requires that you examine all the relationships in your life when making moral decisions, not just a rule. And I think with this model from Vatican II came a series of three paradigm shifts in the moral life, meaning the church moved from a focus on acts to a focus on people, meaning acts themselves are not sinful. People are sinful. People make good and bad choices. Yet people of different ages, different experiences, different educations, they have evolving moral hearts. And so by focusing on the people involved in a moral dilemma and not just the act itself, I think our conscience becomes affected. Our conscience is formed. Uh, this new relational model asks that you think about not the laws of the church, but rather relationships, meaning you can know all the laws, you can know the Ten Commandments, and you still can be a person who makes evil choices. Laws are not the focus of the moral life, then. People are. Who in your relationships are you in trouble with, or have you damaged by a word or an action? Uh, what makes for a healthy relationship? Many people say they have no need to go to confession because, well, I never break any of the Ten Commandments. But oftentimes, then they kind of focus on sexual things. I can honestly say no one's ever confessed to me that they didn't care about the poor or they didn't care about their neighbor. And the relational model requires that you think about these relationships in our shopping, in the companies we buy from, in the stocks we invest in. All of those things affect us and affect our moral decisions. And so the baseline there is not what is the law, but what is the relationship. And finally, the relational model invites us to think about our moral life in, does the decision help me to grow in holiness? Meaning that the moral life is not focused on sins themselves and the consequences of those sins, but rather, how do my decisions help me to grow in holiness? Not focusing on guilt, but rather growing in holiness. Vatican II, I think, gives a beautiful insight into all of this when they speak of the moral life. And that insight comes from the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. In that document, the Church writes, it's a little bit lengthy, but I think it'll kind of give you a different way of looking at this whole moral life and your relationship with that. The Council Fathers wrote, deep within the conscience, man discovers a law which he has not laid upon himself, but which he must obey. It's a voice ever calling him to do what is good and to avoid evil. It tells him inwardly at the right moment, do this, shun that. For we have in our hearts a law inscribed by God. Our dignity lies in observing that law, and by it will we be judged. Our conscience is our most secret core, our sanctuary. There we are alone with God, whose voice echoes in the depths. By conscience, in a wonderful way, that law is made known, which is fulfilled by the love of God and one's neighbor. Through loyalty to conscience, Christians are joined to others in the search for truth and for the right solution to so many moral problems which arrive both in the life of individuals and from social relationships. Hence, the more a correct conscience prevails, the more do persons and groups turn aside from blind choices and try to be guided by the objective standards of moral conduct. Yet it often happens that conscience goes astray through the ignorance which it is unable to avoid without losing its dignity. This cannot be said of a person who takes little trouble to find out what is true and good, or when conscience is by degrees almost blinded through the habit of committing sin. I think the Council Fathers are holding up each of us. The Council Fathers are giving us insights into the value and the beauty that each of your consciences has. It's a lifetime endeavor of forming that conscience. Every one of our consciences is evolving. You might claim to understand and accept or even embrace the church teaching on homosexual relations, but then your child or your brother comes to you and says they're gay, and everything turns upside down. People's experiences change us. They offer a different outlook or viewpoint that affects our consciences. The church has centuries of teaching and reflecting on the documents of the moral life. But even these teachings continue to evolve. And so, in recent years, as we look at the issues surrounding racial equity, we say racism is a sin. How am I, or how have I promoted that sin because of an unformed conscience or an ignorant conscience? I think that's why I've always liked this image that Pope Francis gave about a field hospital, about the church as a place where people who are struggling with moral life come to. It's not a place where I lay down the rules when they walk in the door, but rather a place where I care for them, show them mercy, and leading to a different understanding of the choices they make. I think the church has 2,000 years of moral theology that can guide us. The church has a moral life that is ultimately formed and guided by our relationship with Jesus. And it's that relationship that I think the church invites us to think about. Many get nervous when we don't stress the rules when we're talking about conscience. And so, how can we apply this to our moral lives? Back in high school, I had a high school teacher named Dr. Mike Pennock. And as a young freshman, he gave us a model for approaching moral decisions, which I still find that pops into my head every time those big decisions come to our lives. And in a book that he wrote, The Christian Moral Life, he talks about what he calls the stop sign, the Pennock stop sign, as we used to call it. And he said that when we come to a moral dilemma in our life, or with one of our children, or with a coworker, that it's good to step back and simply stop. That most bad moral choices are made in haste. And so the S of the stop sign stands for search, meaning when we come to a moral decision, it's good to search out the wisdom of friends, of family members, of the community of believers, of scientists. We as Catholics say it's good to search, what are the church teachings here? What does the catechism tell us? What do doctrines, dogmas tell us? 2,000 years of reflecting on the moral life obviously plays a heavy role for us as Catholics. We're invited to think, what does the Bible say about this? So we search for answers there. We consult experts, doctors, priests, scientists, our grandmothers, our grandpas, moms, dads. We search out to gather information about the wisdom, from the wisdom of those around us. And then the T of the stop sign invites us to think about it. Think about all the information that we've gathered, weigh the credibility of a source, meaning an old friend who maybe doesn't have any faith background, although they have some wisdom to offer us, is that going to be the guiding force in our lives? If you're a teenager and you go to your teenage friends, do they have the wisdom of the moral life to really give you guidance? So weigh the credibility of the source. Think about experiences that have affected you as you're approaching this moral decision. It's just not black and white. There's a lot involved with. The O of the stop sign stands for others. How will my action affect other people I live with, other people in my neighborhood, other people in the world? Our shopping affects those working in sweatshops throughout the world. Our, our long history of laughing at racial stereotypes affects people. It's not all about sex. Our moral decisions affect other people. Finally, the P of the stop sign is simply prayer. I take all of this information I've gathered, thinking about others, and I take that to God. And in the quiet of my heart, where my conscience is formed, God speaks to us. God gives us the guidance we need. This stop sign has proved to be an invaluable model for me in my life, and I hope it might help you as well. We live in challenging times. We heard in the first video that the fastest growing denomination in the world are those who call themselves nuns, no religious affiliation. Yet, I suspect that the majority of those nuns are spiritual people who are searching. I don't want to write that audience off. And I do think that we in our Catholic tradition have something to offer in our faith. I hope this session helped you to think about the moral life in a different way. And I pray that it especially might help you during this challenging time to become more human. Because to become more human, as we heard in the last session, was to become more Christ-like. And through the example of your faith, your mercy, your forgiveness of others, you might be able to model for others what true faith in Christ and participating in a church community looks like, and how it all can help you to remain faithful in times of struggle. I'd ask that you continue to pray for me during this holy season, as I always pray for all of you.